give you a little background on myself. I've been paddling for a little over 50 years, and in the mid-1970s, I was certified as a flat water and whitewater canoeing instructor. And as I mentioned, I also ran a wilderness school in North Carolina for 6 years. After that, I moved up to Washington, D.C., and in 1984, I fell in love with sea kayaking, and in the late 1980s, I was fortunate to serve on the National Coastal Kayaking Committee of the American Canoe Association and helped to get their sea kayaking program started, certified a lot of the first instructors in that program. It was a very rewarding time. 10 years ago, I founded the National Center for Cold Water Safety with the help of some really good people, and I've been running it ever since. I would like to say that everybody associated with the center is a volunteer, including myself. We're really passionate about it, and I'm just one guy, but it's the community really of paddlers that are interested in safety that make this center a viable way of getting information out to the paddling community. Also like to introduce you to my wife, Angie Lovett. She's going to be helping me with our class this evening. She's got her own strong background in boating safety. She served in the U.S. Coast Guard for 25 years, the first 6 of which was running search and rescue out of Cape Disappointment at the mouth of the Columbia. You guys are local, so you know what that is like, or at least you know of its fearsome reputation. She's been kayaking, sea kayaking since 2015, and carved her first paddle and learned to roll in 2016 at the Delmarva Paddlers Retreat on the Oregon coast. She's my paddling partner. Oh, the Maryland coast. I'm sorry, I'm flipping back and forth between the East and the West Coast, but Delmarva is one of these traditional Inuit paddling symposia, and that's where she learned to roll and carved her first paddle. So you have her to thank for the fact that this isn't a 3-hour presentation, but rather a 1-hour one. So anyway, with that introduction, thank you so much for letting me speak to you about cold water safety tonight. And I'm going to get started with the presentation. So welcome to building your cold water safety net. Building your cold water safety net is a 2-part process. It isn't complicated, but it does take some time and effort. Tonight, the first thing we're going to look at is why cold water is dangerous. And second, we're going to review the 5 golden rules of cold water safety. They're a set of guidelines that we developed after analyzing hundreds of close calls and fatalities. Each golden rule is important, but it's the combination of all 5 that enables you to build a strong cold water safety net. We're also going to discuss thermal protection. That's the gear that you'll be using to reduce the risk of paddling on cold water. Even though cold water is a very dangerous recreational hazard, it doesn't look that way at all. In fact, it's so well camouflaged that you can stand right next to it and see absolutely nothing dangerous, just a sparkling invitation to get out on the water and have some fun. Cold water doesn't even sound dangerous. If you say 50 Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius water to someone, they mentally compare it to 50 Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius air, which doesn't seem all that cold. But there's a huge difference, because falling into 50 Fahrenheit water is immediately life-threatening. It involves a complete loss of breathing control, huge gasps for air, and if you happen to gasp while your mouth is underwater, you're going to drown. Cold water sets a perfect trap for any paddler who doesn't take it seriously. It doesn't matter whether you're a relatively new paddler, like kayak fisherman Nicholas Brunner, who died on June 12, 2020 in the Pacific Ocean off Trinidad, California, or a seasoned veteran with plenty of experience, like North Face founder and conservationist Doug Tompkins, who died on December 8, 2015, while kayaking with friends on a cold lake in Patagonia, Chile. If you're not prepared for immersion, you're risking your life. So to get started on this, what is cold water? First, let me say you should treat any water temperature below 70 Fahrenheit with caution. But to really put that question in perspective, let's take a look at some different temperatures. 99.6 is your core body temperature. And that's about a degree higher than what you get if you took your temperature with an oral thermometer. 95 Fahrenheit is where we medically define hypothermia as beginning. So it's almost 5 degrees lower than your core temperature. That's where medically the definition was set for clinical hypothermia. 91 Fahrenheit is your average skin temperature, and that's why 85 Fahrenheit water feels cool to the touch. But here's where it starts to get really interesting. The International Olympic Committee requires pool temperatures to be between 77 and 82 Fahrenheit. Now, why is that? It's because they don't want the water temperature to affect performance. They want, in other words, an environmentally neutral playing field for those athletes. And we know from scientific studies that human respiration is adversely affected when the water temperature drops below 76 Fahrenheit. The way we define cold water has safety implications. The Coast Guard used to define it as anything below 60, but then they changed it to 70 Fahrenheit, which is a more sensible definition, particularly when you think about cold water in terms of safety and breathing control. Some paddle sports organizations have their own definitions. For example, the American Canoe Association uses 60 Fahrenheit as their definition for the cutoff point below which they recommend that paddlers wear thermal protection. In other words, what they're saying is, if the temperature is below 60, consider wearing a wetsuit or dry suit. The organization American Whitewater is even worse. Their definition is 50 Fahrenheit, below which they wear that paddlers, below which they say paddlers should wear thermal protection. That's a problem because those guidelines essentially undermine cold water safety. We're going to visit this later, but I just want to point out that those 50 and 60 Fahrenheit definitions don't have any scientific basis. And in fact, they're dangerously misleading. And here's why. Most people will experience maximum intensity cold shock between 50 and 60 Fahrenheit. In other words, they'll be gasping and hyperventilating as hard and fast as they can get. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But I just want to point that out because from a safety standpoint, it doesn't make any sense to set the recommendation for thermal protection at 50 or 60 degrees. And that's why we say treat any temperature below 70 with caution. At 45 Fahrenheit, immersion is very painful. 32, freshwater freezes, 28, saltwater freezes. But I'll tell you, if you are dropped into 45 Fahrenheit water without thermal protection, it's really a horrific experience. So I guess the question then is, why don't more paddlers take cold water seriously? Back this up just a tiny bit. In my experience, the thing that trips people up when they think about cold water is that unless they have direct personal experience being in it, and I mean experience actually swimming or floating in, say, 50 Fahrenheit water, the mental comparison they make is going to be with 50 Fahrenheit air, which does not feel that cold by comparison. This is just a little trick that your brain does behind the scenes without you even thinking about it, a little calculation that reaches a completely mistaken conclusion. And that conclusion is that there isn't any difference between 50 Fahrenheit air and 50 Fahrenheit water. That's the mistake that gets a lot of people into trouble, because when it comes to heat loss, water is very different from air. It has much greater density. It immediately destroys much of the insulation provided by your clothing, and it also conducts heat away from your body much faster than air. So in practical terms, even if the water is the same temperature as the air, it feels a lot colder. For example, 45 Fahrenheit air feels cold, but 45 Fahrenheit water feels like it's burning your skin. So how does cold water affect your body? To answer that question, we're going to look at 3 stages of immersion: cold shock, incapacitation, and hypothermia. Now, these are 3 distinct threats to your life, and they affect you in different ways, but they all have one thing in common. They greatly increase your risk of inhaling water and drowning. Cold shock is the first threat to your survival. It happens the moment that cold water makes contact with a large area of your skin, not just your face, but more like your entire chest or your back, your abdomen, that sort of thing. Incapacitation is second, and it involves cooling your muscles and nerves to the point where they simply stop working. At first, they get weak, then they get weaker, and finally they don't work at all. And the colder the water, the faster that happens. Hypothermia, on the other hand, involves a drop in your deep body or core temperature, the temperature of your brain, heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, in other words, your vital organs. By the way, you can drown in the cold shock stage, the incapacitation stage, and the hypothermia stage. The thing to keep in mind is that these are sequential, and you have to survive cold shock before incapacitation or hypothermia even become an issue. So let's look at cold shock. What is cold shock? As you can probably imagine, I get that question a lot, and popular variation is, that's when you gasp, isn't it? And I'd say, yes, sort of, but it's not a little gasp like someone startled you. It's full lung inflations, usually multiple times in a row and totally out of your control. So it's like taking a giant breath of air that completely fills your lungs, and you have no control over that. If your mouth happens to be underwater when you gasp, you're done. You just drowned. That's how fast it happened. And right after the gasps, you have hyperventilation. That's rapid, uncontrolled breathing, which creates all sorts of additional problems. Also, you won't be able to hold your breath, and you'll feel like you're suffocating. In addition to increasing the odds of suddenly drowning from inhaling water, this loss of breathing control causes swimming failure. And without the support of a PFD or something you can use as flotation, you'll sink and immediately drown. Your heart rate and your blood pressure also go through the roof, so hopefully there's no weakness in that system. There's also a huge reduction in your ability to think and function, to call for help, get back in your kayak or canoe or back on your paddleboard. And this mental confusion can continue for a long time, even after you get out of the water. So I'd say, yeah, it's a lot more than just a gasp. Cold shock got its name for a good reason. And I like to say that short of being hit by a bus or struck by lightning, cold shock is one of the biggest physical jolts that your body can experience. Here are some key points. And remember, all of this is out of your control. It's an involuntary response, and you can't make it stop just by thinking about it or, quote unquote, trying not to panic. So you've got a total loss of breathing control, gasping, hyperventilation, difficulty holding your breath. You've got swimming failure, which happens in 2 ways. First, because you're unable to coordinate your breathing with your swimming strokes, and you need to do that in order to swim, and you're unable to make progress in the water. So you've got In a nutshell, a huge risk of water inhalation and sudden drowning. What we've got here, this is a graphic 3-minute video of volunteers trying to swim a short distance in 45 Fahrenheit water without PFDs. You'll watch as they experience cold shock, swimming failure, and incapacitation. Now, in real life, one of these volunteers would have drowned within 15 feet. Another barely made it 20 yards before his arms gave out. And when you watch this, remember that it was filmed in a controlled setting. There were multiple rescue swimmers in the water with the volunteers. One of the volunteers is a fellow by the name of Mario Vitoni. He's an international marine safety consultant. He's also extremely determined and fit, and he recently retired as a U.S. Coast Guard rescue swimmer. So even so, it took everything he had to reach shore, and he could barely stand when his feet touched bottom. Another thing I want you to notice in the video is what the rescue swimmers are wearing. They're definitely dressed for immersion, and they're fine. They had to spend a lot of time in that water while the video was being filmed, and you don't see them struggling or grimacing. They're just fine, no trouble dealing with it at all. Let me just, I have to do one thing here to get you so that you can hear the audio. Oh, here we go. Got to share sound, one of those little technical things. Okay, so here we go with this video. What?
Can't breathe, like you have no control. But I think with the rescue swimmer calming me down, at some point, like, your body just goes numb.
When you're ready, when you're ready. It's okay. All right?
Yeah.
So if the rescue swimmer hadn't been there, what do you think would have happened?
I probably would have panicked.
And then what?
Drowned.
I felt like it took about a minute and a half to get over that. Hyperventilating, and the skin started to feel a lot different. From cold to a little number, and then under hurt, burning kind of pain. I couldn't go much. I was about to go there, I thought. I didn't think I'd be able to stand up.
Okay, that gets us back on track. We have an extended version of that that incorporates some of the comments I made at the beginning of this class, and I'm going to forward those to Marie along with some other information that we have that hasn't yet made it onto our website, so be on the lookout for those. We get most of our scientific knowledge about things like cold shock and incapacitation from human subject research that's conducted in environmental physiology labs at colleges and universities. It's very important work, but it's also important to understand it in context. Because when it comes to cold water immersion, there's a big difference between let's say, a research lab and an actual life or death situation in which someone is struggling to survive. And what I'm saying is that cold shock is a far more intense experience in the real world, because as soon as they're in the water, people immediately realize that they're fighting for their lives. They're unfamiliar with cold water. They're stunned and surprised. They know within seconds that they're in desperate trouble, and they're terrified of drowning. On the other hand, the people who participate in scientific cold shock experiments are relaxed volunteers. They're familiar with cold water. They know in advance what's going to happen. They know that they're not in any real danger of drowning, and they're not afraid that they're going to die. Nevertheless, despite all that reassurance, they experience cold shock for 2 to 3 minutes, and it can take them up to 5 minutes to get their breathing stabilized at about twice the level that it was before they were immersed in cold water. This is what you're looking at in terms of the difference between real life and a lab test. So how long does cold shock last? It's a good question, and when you think about it, remember what I just said about research versus real life. The average is 3 to 5 minutes for relaxed volunteers. But what about the real world when people are traumatized by the experience? One way to look at this question and at the same time clear up some information about cold water safety is to examine the 1-10-1 cold water immersion myth. Now, this is something that we discuss on our website along with a bunch of other myths about cold water safety. This particular one was invented by a Canadian cold water researcher by the name of Gordon Geisbrecht, and it was popularized by the cold water boot camp video. It's inaccurate, it's not supported by either science or practical experience, and it undermines cold water safety by understating the danger. This is what the 1-10-1 says. You have 1 minute to get your breathing under control. That's inaccurate and it's misleading, because you actually have a loss of breathing control, a total loss of breathing control that can last for 5 minutes or more, and that's if you're a volunteer. In one real-life incident that we cover in detail on our website, a kayaker by the name of Randy Morgart capsized in 32 Fahrenheit water on the Mississippi River. He wasn't wearing a wetsuit or dry suit, and he spent about 10 minutes in the water before he was able to self-rescue. That was a desperate life or death struggle, and he barely made it back into his kayak on his final try. Now, he reported that 15 minutes after he got out of the water, he was still hyperventilating, and he said, and I quote, "I noticed my vision getting dark around the edges and a roaring in my ears that almost covered the usual river noises." In other words, the darkness was closing in on Randy as he struggled to paddle back to the boat ramp. That's a classic symptom of hyperventilation syndrome, and it was happening 25 minutes after he capsized and 15 minutes after he got out of the water. So I'd say so much for having 1 minute to get your breathing under control. Now let's look at incapacitation. You remember Mario. This just isn't anybody or any swimmer. This is a US Coast Guard rescue swimmer, and he's been absolutely hammered by that 45 Fahrenheit water. Physical incapacitation is it's just another way of saying that you've become physically helpless in the water because you can no longer control your arms, legs, hands, and feet. When you're helpless in the water, particularly in waves, you're very likely to drown because even with the added buoyancy of a PFD, your mouth is very close to the surface of the water. How close? There's an organization called Boat US. They tested type 3 PFDs. That's the kind that most of us kayakers wear. They found that the distance between the water surface and the mouth in flat water conditions was 3 inches. So think about that, 3 inches between your mouth and the water at a time when your breathing is out of control and your ability to hold your breath is shot. In whitewater paddling in our community, I don't think that there's an adequate appreciation of the fact that this is a major contributor to flush drownings. But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because if your breathing is out of control and you're getting washed down a river and you're getting, periodically submerged and overwashed by waves, the chance of you inhaling water and drowning is greatly increased. So I think this is something that you'll find as we do more education in the paddling community, that awareness increases and that a greater appreciation will develop for the benefit of wearing thermal protection, particularly in whitewater. I know Mario Vitoni. He's a very fit, strong, incredibly determined man. But when your muscles and nerves get cold enough, they simply stop working. And this loss of sensation, muscle strength, and control happens very quickly. With the exception of your hands, this is a situation where size matters. So small bodies are going to cool faster than large ones. A skinny person is going to cool faster than someone with a lot of body fat, and children are going to cool faster than adults. Here's something to think about. In very cold water, it's possible to lose the use of your hands in under a minute. So if you think about that, your hands are numb and useless. This is not a good situation if you're trying to survive. Here's our 110-1 myth again. It says you have 10 minutes during which time you'll be physically able to help yourself. Now, unfortunately, cold water immersion isn't that simple. And here's a perfect example that busts that myth. Gordon Geisbrecht, the same guy who cooked up the 110-1, well, he participated in an incapacitation experiment in which he jumped into ice water wearing a snowmobile suit. He had to be pulled out of the water after 6 minutes because he was physically helpless after swimming only 50 feet. So I'd say, again, so much for the 10 minutes. You don't have 10 minutes until you are incapacitated. What you've got is a gradually diminishing ability to help yourself, in which every single minute you get progressively weaker. And at the end of that period of time, you're just hanging there in your life jacket, however long it takes, and you can't move your arms and legs. There are plenty of whitewater boaters who have wound up swimming not a very long distance or not much time in the water, swimming to shore, and found themselves so weak that it was all they could do to crawl out of the water, just like Mario was in that picture. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. I want to say one more thing about swimming failure. If you're not wearing a PFD, you're going to drown as soon as you can no longer swim. If you remember how difficult it was for the volunteers in that video to keep their mouths clear of the water, that is the impression I want to leave you with. Swimming failure is a major threat in 2 out of the 3 stages of immersion. It can happen during the cold shock stage because you can't coordinate your breathing and your swim strokes, but it can also happen during the incapacitation stage because your muscles get weak and they stop working. And without a PFD, when your muscles stop working, you drown. And even with a PFD, you're just hanging there helpless in the water and you can't move your arms and legs. So that's cold shock and incapacitation, and that's how swimming failure ties into it. So let's talk for a minute about hypothermia. Hypothermia means low body temperature. And in a heat emergency, when your body is losing heat faster than it can replace it, there's an automatic defense system that kicks in. The first thing that happens is your body reduces the circulation of warm blood to the hands and feet. Second, circulation to the arms and legs is reduced. And third, shivering begins. Because if you don't have enough heat to keep your entire body warm, your core automatically gets priority. This is a survival mechanism and you cannot control it. Eventually, if heat loss continues to exceed heat production, your core temperature starts to fall. And when it reaches 95, which takes about 30 minutes, by the way, for an average adult, even in very cold water, that's when you reach the point that's medically defined as hypothermia. But let's look at this clearly. By that point, you're already physically incapacitated. And 95 is also the point at which your mind starts getting really fuzzy because your brain is colder. And it's important to note that shivering begins long before hypothermia develops. So while shivering can be a symptom of hypothermia, it's also what I call an early warning sign. So pay attention to it because the best time to deal with hypothermia is before it happens. Prevention is a whole lot easier than treatment, particularly when you're in the outdoors. Now, this kind of core shell circulation chart, this concept, I know it seems kind of abstract, but it has some very practical implications if you understand it. And here's one. Let's say you're paddling with some friends and the weather is cold. What I recommend doing is asking whether everybody's hands and feet are warm, because if your body is having trouble staying warm, the first things to go are the hands and feet. In other words, for most people, cold hands and feet are an early warning sign. Not that the person is about to become hypothermic, but that they need to do a better job of conserving body heat, a better job of reducing their heat loss to the environment. So that's just one practical application of understanding how this, how your body distributes heat and so on. Let's now look at the 5 golden rules. These are the tools you'll be using to build a cold water safety net. And this is what we promote at the National Center for Cold Water Safety in terms of building that safety net. We developed these after analyzing hundreds of close calls and fatalities. They're practical, they're easy to understand, and anyone can use them. And they are: wear your PFD, always dress for the water temperature, field test your gear, swim test your gear, and plan for the worst that can happen. As I may have mentioned before, each one of these rules is important, but it's the combination of all 5 that empowers you to build a strong cold water safety net. These rules are explained in great detail on our website. There are also 20 close calls and fatalities, case histories that are associated with the rules. So when you go to our website, be sure to read those so that you can learn from the mistakes that other people have made and avoid making them yourself. For example, take rule number 5, plan for the worst that can happen. What could possibly go wrong on a simple kayak outing? If you visit our website, you can read all about it. And I'd say, in my experience, one basic truth about any outdoor sport, from hiking a 3-mile loop on an easy trail to climbing a 20,000-foot mountain like Denali, is that it's a lot easier to read about and avoid mistakes that other people have made than it is to learn about it the hard way by making those same mistakes yourself. What does dressing for the water temperature mean? Some people look at that picture and they say, no way I'm going to wear that much gear. Fine, I say, that's your life, your choice, but let's be really clear about it. If the water's really cold, that's how much gear you need. And if you don't have the gear, it's a bad idea to go out on the water, because even with all that water, even with all that gear on, the 40 Fahrenheit water feels like it's burning the exposed skin on your face, the part that's not covered by the neoprene hood. You can only imagine what that feels like if it's your whole body that's exposed to the water. The volunteers in that video we watched were trying to swim a short distance in 45 Fahrenheit water, and they were really suffering and struggling. You could see it in their faces, and you could hear it in their voices. And without the added flotation provided by a PFD, they were all within a moment of drowning if they ran out of energy or had to rest for a moment to try and catch their breath. Here's a great picture of my late friend, Eric Soares. He was the co-founder of the Tsunami Rangers sea kayaking team. Now, Eric preferred wetsuits for his gnarly rock garden adventures on the Pacific coast because he was concerned about the possibility of a dry suit getting torn or holed on some barnacle-encrusted rock. And what I'm saying here is just to leave you with the thought that dry suits and wetsuits both have pros and cons. One isn't automatically better than the other, and I think it depends on the circumstances and the conditions. Now here we've got a very good example of dry suits and wetsuits working just fine in really cold conditions. And you can look at these 3. They're having a really good time, even though they're dripping with icicles.
Icicles, yeah, Jesus.
But this is, this is what thermal protection does when it's working. They're not, you contrast them, they've just been out in very, very cold water, and they're having a good time. And they're paddlers, and they're prepared because they've tested that gear and they know how it works. So dressing for the water temperature, to recap, it means wearing thermal protection like a wetsuit or dry suit so you don't experience cold shock. It means wearing enough thermal protection so that you remain warm, calm, and able to function physically and mentally while you're in the water, whatever the water temperature happens to be. If you're wearing a wetsuit, it means wearing one that's thick enough to protect you from the cold and snug enough to work properly. If it's a dry suit, it means wearing a dry suit that doesn't leak, isn't excessively burped, and has enough warm clothing underneath it to protect you from the cold. It means wearing enough protection to keep you functioning if you have to swim or get towed to shore, and if you can't get to shore and you're out in open water, enough protection to keep you alive long enough to be rescued. You'll hear a lot of people say that wetsuits aren't effective below 50 Fahrenheit. I'd say try telling that to a North Shore surfer on Lake Superior in the dead of winter, because those guys rock the Neo and they love to get their picture taken looking like this, because it's, I imagine it's a real unusual thrill if you're a surfer. I want to say one word about underdressing, because I think it's a serious issue. In my experience, the real issue is that most paddlers either don't dress for immersion at all, or else they underdress. And either way, they're not wearing enough protection when they go paddling on cold water. And they don't know that because they don't get into the water to see how it feels. Now, this paddler is completely unaware of the risk that he's taking. Bare feet, bare hands, no head protection, no thermal protection, and a waist-mounted, manually inflatable PFD with the pull tab hanging behind him where it's going to be hard to reach. This guy would be very unlikely to survive falling off his board because he'd drown before he could even think about inflating his PFD. And he has no idea of the risk he's taking. Back in the 1970s, before cold shock was more widely understood, there was a special term for this situation where people fell in the water without protection and just disappeared. It was called sudden disappearance syndrome. And here's how it worked. The victim wasn't wearing a life jacket, fall out of the boat, hit the water, they go under, they gasp, and they never even resurface. They're just gone. Witnesses, you ask them what happened, they say, I don't know, he just fell over and suddenly disappeared. That's what happens when you take a huge involuntary gasp and your mouth is underwater. Here's a question I have for anyone that's an instructor or trip leader. How can you tell if the people on your outing are dressed for the water temperature? And second, how can they tell if they are? Because you're there at the put-in, a bunch of people show up, and they're, you know, everybody's kind of getting ready and you're getting your own gear sorted out, and then everybody kind of comes down to the put-in and they're wearing their dry suits. How can you tell that they're really dressed for the water temperature? How do you know that they're not wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt or some skimpy little outfit underneath that dry suit, and in fact, you're going out and you're going to be paddling 145 Fahrenheit water? How can they tell? How can they tell that they don't have enough protection to keep them safe? And the way that you can do that is by swim testing your gear before you head out. This is something that Angie and I do every single time we paddle, and we do it on the front end of the paddle, not the back end. The front end, before we ever launch the kayaks, we get in our gear, we go down with our PFDs on, we wade into the water, take the temperature of the water, figure out what it is, and make sure, in my case in particular, that I've been careful about closing the relief zipper. I'm embarrassed to say, but it's certainly true. There have been a couple of times when I haven't closed it all the way. Thought it was closed all the way, but there's that last little tug, and I hadn't done that. And boy, the second the water gets up to that zipper, you know that you need to fix something. So that's one reason for swim testing your gear. These are folks in 45 or 40 degree Fahrenheit water at a seminar that I taught in Annapolis, Maryland. And when we did these live, we almost always had swim tests with them, if it was at all possible. This is a very controlled and protected location. One guy you'll notice is practicing swimming with his paddle. I think that's a very good idea, particularly if you're on a larger body of water, because it's a lot faster to swim with your paddle than without it. And I practice it swimming forwards and also using it as a backstroke. I prefer the backstroke in most situations because the water's not smacking me in the face and I can get more of my body out of the water, and it's a little more relaxing and efficient. These folks were having fun and they were learning firsthand how well the insulation under their dry suits was working. Now, some of them were underdressed. They got out of the water early. Others were better prepared, but everybody learned something from this swim test. So how do you swim test your gear? I recommend individually taking the water temperature, because I think that there's something about doing it yourself that tends to embed that information in your brain better than if your buddy takes it and says, hey, Joe, the water temperature is 50 Fahrenheit. I think if you take it yourself, you get in the water, you splash around, you don't have to go any distance. You're just splashing around a little bit. You see how it feels. You think about it. Will you be warm enough if you fall in? This is something that injects reality into the paddle right on the front end. And so that's the big reason that it's one of our golden rules. Let's see if I can go back and whoops. Let's drive here. Safety net. Man. Transitioning between these little videos and the slides is a little difficult sometimes. Let me scroll back up here and get us to where we need to be. Almost there.
Surprisingly good.
There we go. I'm sorry. So what's the difference between a swim test and a field test? I like to think of it like this. Swim testing is like a pilot's pre-flight test. It's a last-minute check to make sure your protective equipment is working and that you're wearing enough protection to keep you warm if you wind up in the water. Field testing, on the other hand, is making sure that your gear works the way it's supposed to. So field testing is how you become familiar with your gear and learn to use it effectively. So how and where do you field test? My recommendation is practice with your gear in a safe location in weather conditions or at water temperatures like the ones in which you'll be paddling. You need to know how your gear performs in those conditions, and field testing gives you the opportunity to work out any kinks in the system. It's particularly important to field test any new gear. And here's one of the things you want to learn. For example, with all your gear on, if you're an open water paddler, can you deploy, inflate, use, and stow a paddle float? Can you find the grab loop on your spray skirt? Can you pump out your cockpit? Can you effectively use a GPS, cell phone, or VHF radio? Can you find and blow your whistle? Can you do a boat-to-boat rescue as a rescuer or victim? And many of those examples involve making absolutely sure through experimentation and practice that you can use your hands to do things while wearing neoprene gloves or mittens. If you have on a pair of, let's say, NRS toaster mitts, which are excellent neoprene mittens, but you haven't practiced grabbing the grab loop on your spray skirt, that's a problem, because you don't want to be upside down feeling around and realizing you can't feel the grab loop with those mittens on. And the only way that you can pop that skirt is to get your thumb into the grab loop and do it. You can't grab the side of it and pull it off. None of that stuff works. And the gloves have Velcro fasteners, so trying to get the gloves off, that's a problem too. So that's one of the things that you're getting with field testing. Another thing is you might have a great roll, but most of us, when we roll, we get completely upside down into what we call a setup position. But if you've got a little too much air in that dry suit and you capsize, one of the things that happens is you don't become completely inverted. You're not completely upside down. So when you go to roll, you're not really set up. And there's a technique for dealing with that. So take one hand off the paddle, do a couple of sweep strokes with your hand. It gets you firmly upside down. Then you can set up and roll. But if you've never practiced that, if you don't know that it happens, if you haven't field tested the gear, you're upside down and you can't figure out what in the world is going on. You just know something's wrong and it's not working. So that's just another example of field testing. Open water kayakers, I say, you know, you got to be able to operate your VHF radio. A lot of people say, oh, you know, pogies are great. Yes, they are. But if you're not wearing a lightweight Neo glove under those pogies, I think that's a mistake, because the problem with pogies has always been that the second you have to remove your hand to do anything from scratch your nose to reattach a spray skirt, pump out a cockpit, whatever, you have no protection at all. And believe me, you can be toasty warm in your dry suit. If you lose the use of your hands, you are in serious trouble, and that can happen in a minute. Numb hands, useless hands, can't feel anything. You might as well have boxing gloves on. So this is, you know, just another example about why field testing is one of the 5 golden rules. Let's talk for a second about cold water gear, because it's not enough to simply buy a wetsuit or dry suit. This is survival gear. And I think that's the way that we should think about it, survival gear. So take the time to make sure you understand how it works. Make sure it's working properly. That's why we field test. That's why we swim test. Because if things go badly wrong, our lives depend on that gear. I think this is a message that we really need to share, particularly with new paddlers, because somebody says, well, you got to dress for the water temperature. You need to go out and buy a wetsuit or dry suit. So they do. They go out and they buy a wetsuit. Maybe it's too loose and the water flushes in and out. Maybe it's too thin and too loose. So really it doesn't work very well. It doesn't prevent cold shock if it's too loose and the water flushes in and out. And if they don't wear enough clothing underneath their dry suit, it's just not going to work very well. So your gear has to work when you're actually in the water. And if you're wearing a dry suit or dry top, in order to prevent cold shock, it has to keep the cold water away from your skin. Now, to do that, it has to be more than just waterproof. It has to be watertight in order to protect you. I would say, looking at this, wearing rain pants, a fleece pullover, and a paddling jacket is not dressing for the water temperature. Paddling jackets are a perfect example of waterproof versus watertight. They're not watertight. And they aren't suitable for immersion because they leak badly when you're actually in the water. That's not surprising because they're really just rain jackets with neoprene wrist and neck cuffs. The problem is that manufacturers and retailers act like there's no difference between paddling jackets and dry tops. They even use phrases like this to sell paddling jackets. They say, extend your season in style, which in paddling terms means paddle in late fall and early spring when the water temperature is much colder. They say paddling jackets comfortably keep out water. Yeah, they do when you're paddling in the rain, but that's not going to work if you capsize. They also say stuff like waterproof, breathable fabric will keep you dry and comfortable. Yes, it will, as long as you're not actually in the water. My point here is that manufacturers and retailers aren't at all clear about paddling jackets and what they can and can't do. In fact, many of their ads are very misleading. That's a problem because, again, this is survival gear. Your life can depend on it working properly. And if you buy the wrong gear because you were misled about the way it works, misled by advertising and product descriptions about the kind of protection that it provides, it's your life that's on the line. When you think about gear and safety, an important point to keep in mind is that manufacturers, retailers, and safety advocates like me have very different priorities. This is what I like to call the intersection of commerce and safety. The priority of manufacturers is sales. Same goes for the people they hire to do their advertising and marketing. Same goes for the retailers who sell their product. Their priority is sales. They frequently know little or nothing about cold water safety, and if they do, it takes a back seat to sales. So this is something that is really important, and I think once you understand the danger of an unprotected cold water immersion, you'll start to notice this kind of advertising where they don't really tell you how the gear works. And the bottom line on this is that ultimately you're the one who's responsible for your own safety. And your job as a safety conscious paddler is to make sure that your gear works. If you've been misled by some paddling magazine article or the information on some manufacturer's website, field testing is how you correct that misinformation. And this ad that you're looking at right now, this is a photo from an ad selling paddling jackets. And paddling jackets are not going to protect you in that particular environment. So field testing is the way that you inject reality into that system. What precautions do you need for cold water paddling? The only thing that really matters when you're neck deep in cold water is whether or not you're wearing gear that's going to prevent cold shock and delay incapacitation and hypothermia. Delay it long enough for you to sort things out, or else allow you to survive long enough for someone else to rescue you. That's the bottom line. Now look at this list. What's missing? It's thermal protection. There's nothing about thermal protection anywhere on this list. Don't you think that's a little bit odd? I certainly do, but there's a reason for it, because most of these recommendations were also developed in the mid-1980s by people with a financial interest in the sport, whose goal was to convince paddlers that they didn't really need thermal protection like wetsuits or dry suits. They were afraid that telling people about paddling hazards would hurt business. Now, that's a very short-sighted, self-serving, irresponsible perspective. And it's also, interestingly enough, not the way that safety education works. There's nothing wrong with the stuff on this group. It's just that none of it, absolutely none of it, is going to help you when you first go into cold water. It just isn't. And emphasizing this sort of thing, I think, is a mistake. When you look at a list like this, or you look at the 7 essentials that you need for winter paddling, and you don't see thermal protection anywhere on the list, that is not an accident. It's a holdover from the 1980s, and we need to bury it. How do we know that telling paddlers a realistic, giving them a realistic assessment of the dangers inherent in paddling, how do we know that that doesn't ruin business or scare paddlers away from it? This is a perfect example from 43 years ago. This is an excellent but very scary film that the American Red Cross produced in 1977 about whitewater kayaking hazards, called The Uncalculated Risk. I'm going to send a link to Marie so that you guys can go online, or you just Google The Uncalculated Risk, and this thing will pop up on my channel. This was out of circulation it took me a long time to find an archived copy of this that was digital and that we could upload to the internet, but here it is. And this film didn't stop anyone from paddling, not at all, but it did save a lot of lives. And all the paddlers that I taught really appreciated learning about hazards like strainers, hydraulics, low head dams, foot entrapment, and cold water, so they could be prepared for them, so they could avoid them. This particular film was brilliant. Even the title of the film was thought-provoking, because an uncalculated risk is one that you take without even knowing that you're doing something risky. It's like new paddlers putting on a river that's high and fast, and they have absolutely no idea what a strainer is. Come around the bend, it doesn't look all that dangerous, or they see that horizon line and they don't realize it's a low head dam and they haven't scouted it out, and the closer they get, it doesn't look particularly dangerous, but oh my goodness, it sure is. And that's an uncalculated risk. It's going out and just, whee, let's launch the boats, and they have no idea. And I think as whitewater paddlers, we really appreciate that, because none of those dangers are, I think, you have to be taught about them in order to appreciate them. And that's why I think in paddling, we've got this long tradition of educating our fellow paddlers about hazards. If you flip this on its head and you say, well, what's a calculated risk? Well, the calculated risk is one that you take with your eyes wide open, one that you prepare for. It's an educated approach to dealing with hazards. That's what whitewater safety is all about. It's taking calculated risks. Speaking of preparation, I wrote a guide to cold water paddling gear last November, actually. It's been a year now. It's free. And again, we're going to send you a link to it. That's a place where you can read more about cold water protection, why you need it, and what are some of the commonly asked questions, and you can share it with people. But I want to just tonight hit a couple of the highlights about this. Not go into all the detail, but let's talk first about dry suits. By itself, a dry suit provides about as much insulation as a shower curtain. You've got to wear clothes underneath it in order to insulate yourself from the water. It's the thickness of that insulation that determines how warm you'll be. Now, layering's fine in theory, But layering underneath a dry suit doesn't give you the same flexibility to regulate comfort on the move that you have, let's say, on a trail hike, because adding or removing layers to a dry suit isn't something you can do out on the water. You got to come ashore and, you fool around with it. You got to remove part of the dry suit or the whole thing. You add the layers, you put the suit back on. It's a little complicated and time consuming. It's not just like stopping on the side of the trail, pulling something out of your pack. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that burping your dry suit to get rid of any excess air will compress your insulation. And this is a balancing act. So remember, thickness is warmth. If you burp the suit, it reduces the thickness, and that reduces the insulation of your dry suit. Now you see an excellent example of that in this picture. That paddler was very cold after being in the water just a little while, and it looks like the insulation's been shrink wrapped. So what I'd say is that swim testing and field testing, once again, that's how you determine how much insulation you need for a particular water temperature. The other thing it tells you is if you burp that suit, how much you can burp it. Maybe you want to get rid of some air and you say, well, gosh, I'm not quite warm enough. So you add a little insulation to compensate for that. And eventually you work that balance out so that you know exactly how much to burp and exactly how much insulation to have at whatever water temperature it is that you're paddling in. The bottom line, I think, is that the most important question you want to answer for yourself is this: with the amount of clothing that you're wearing underneath your dry suit, will you be chilled and shook up after spending 5 minutes in the water, for example, during a rescue, or you're being washed down the river and you're trying to swim for shore, or will you be just fine? How about if you have to spend 15 minutes in the water? If you're going to take a calculated risk approach to paddling, you really need to know stuff like that. Now let's take a little peek at wetsuits. Wetsuits have to be snug fitting to be effective. As I mentioned before, if the water can flush in and out of the wetsuit, it's not going to prevent cold shock, and it's going to do a very poor job of delaying incapacitation and hypothermia. It's the thickness of the neoprene that determines how much protection the wetsuit provides. And there's a huge difference between a 3 mil and a 7 mil wetsuit. Now take a peek at this picture. A Farmer John wetsuit has a significant disadvantage in very cold water because it leaves your arms and shoulders completely exposed. That's going to be a big problem if the water's below 60 Fahrenheit. And the colder the water, the faster you'll lose the use of your arms. So my recommendation is if you use a Farmer John in cold water, pair it with a dry top, not a paddling jacket, and an insulating layer. Make sure the dry top seals tightly at the waist, field test and swim test it to make sure it works. You can also use a neoprene jacket over that. My old wetsuit is a Farmer John, and it's paired with a long sleeve shorty. So the wetsuit comes down to my thighs, but it has long sleeves. And that means I have twice the thickness on my core, because the core is covered not just by the Farmer John, but also by the long sleeve shorty. Let's talk a little bit about hand protection, because even if you're wearing a top-of-the-line dry suit with all the appropriate layers underneath, or a suitably thick and snug wetsuit, you're in big trouble if your hands become numb and useless. And this can happen in minutes in very cold water. Neoprene is the gold standard for head and neck protection. Wool and fleece hats like the one on the left, they're almost useless when you're actually in cold water. The other good thing about Neo head protection is it also protects your ears and eliminates vertigo. Nothing will screw your roll up faster than having a shot of cold water in your ear, because that causes for most people, instant vertigo. And that's a completely disorienting, loss of balance situation. And it's going to make it difficult or impossible for you to roll. On the neoprene, I like the balaclava design as the water temperatures drop. And in fact, I have both of these, and when it gets really cold, I'll wear the balaclava as well as the hood. I'll wear the hood on top of the balaclava. The thing I don't like about the hood as temperatures drop is there's no neck protection. And I think that's, that can be a problem in terms of safety. Here's another reason to field test your gear. This is a Kokatat surf skin balaclava. I don't think it works very well in water because when the fabric on the face gets soaking wet, unless you can exhale forcefully and blow that water out of the fabric, when you take a huge breath when you're coming up for air, that water is going to go in to your mouth, and some of it's going to get in your lungs. That can cause problems. It feels like you're choking, feels like you can't breathe. So I don't like this at all. I also think it's not snug enough to work well. So this is another example of what somebody thought was a good idea, and it's a great idea on the trail or maybe for mountain climbing, doesn't work well if you're actually immersed, if you capsize and that whole thing gets wet and then you try to take a breath of air. So another reason to test your gear. Neoprene hand protection comes in various thicknesses. There's sometimes when I love just a lightweight neo glove. There are other times when I need something more. And so I'll switch to a medium weight glove. When it gets really cold and the medium weight gloves don't work enough, then I'll switch to the lightweight and put a heavyweight neo mitten over the top of it. And as I mentioned before, neo mittens are warmer than gloves. Now that's because your individual fingers aren't exposed to cold, but you've got to make sure that you can operate your gear with those mittens on. One little thing I'll share with you about gloves is if they fit too tightly, they can reduce the circulation of warm blood to your hands. So remember, the only thing that's keeping your hands warm is warm blood going down the arms from the core. And if something like a latex gasket on your dry suit coupled with a neoprene glove that's a little bit too snug, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep your hands warm. So I like to have my gloves and mittens a little on the loose side for exactly that reason. And I also don't like my latex gaskets too tight. Pogies. I mentioned that a little bit before. I'm just going to mention it again. Pogies are great, but if you wear them, you should wear something like a lightweight neo glove underneath, so that in the event that you have to get your hands out, they're still going to be warm. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the talk tonight. I started the National Center for Cold Water Safety because I looked a lot on the internet 11 years ago, and I didn't see anything that I thought was decent as far as cold water safety. So that's the purpose of the center. We want to be your cold water resource. We're a nonprofit organization, and you can go to our website where you can review what you learned today. You can use it as a blueprint for building your safety net. You can get additional information on a lot of different stuff there. 20 real-life close calls and fatalities. And I encourage you to refer friends to us who have questions or link to us on social media. We're an interesting organization in that we don't accept advertising. I don't think there's no place. I just don't think there's a place for advertising on a site like this. I think it distracts from the message. I think it just clutters it up. And a little while ago, when I noticed that some of the videos we had on YouTube, they were putting ads in there, I moved them all over to Vimeo because I don't want that advertising. By the same token, we don't accept any corporate donations. Believe me, we get offers. I won't do it. And the reason I won't do it is because you cannot be an objective safety organization if you're accepting money from industry, because it compromises your objectivity. The first thing that happens is Joe Blow Company gives you a little bit of money, and then they do something that really has steam shooting out of your ears and that deserves to be criticized, but you hesitate because they gave you money. This is an established fact of human psychology. We don't take corporate donations. So we're completely funded by individual donations, and every single person associated with the center, including me, is a volunteer. Nobody gets paid anything. So when you go to our website, if you appreciate that and you appreciate the work that we're doing, I ask you to support us, however you can. It's easy to donate to the center on the website. It's tax deductible, and it makes a huge difference in our ability to get the word out. So any of you that can do that, I'd really appreciate it. So I'm going to get out of my little screen here, and we'll turn my little camera back on. Says Angie, turn my camera back on. Here I am again. Anyway, so that's how to build your cold water safety net. I hope it was useful to you, and I encourage you to visit our website. And as a friend of mine at a large company tells his people, go there and dig deep, because there's a lot of information. I think you'll find it interesting, practical, and useful.
Hey, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you, Moulton.
Thank you.
yeah,
very
and I
much.
think Ken has had his hand up and said he had some questions.
Okay, I'm ready.
I'm not sure you are.
Well, I might not be.
Yeah. It actually started a long time ago. And actually, one of them is a functional question. There's a 40 to 60 degree, temperature Fahrenheit, max intestine cold shock. Is there an age component to that? I mean, would younger be warmer? That's a simple question. Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yeah, you'd think it would be a simple question, but it's not 40 to 60, it's 50 to 60.
Excuse me.
And the answer is no. Did Ken lose his audio again? Anyway, the question.
I'm sorry, evidently, Mr. Avery, I was muted. So what your answer was is that irrespective of age, in that temperature range, you could experience that outcome.
Exactly. And the thing is that this is a physiological response over which you have no control. It's involuntary. And there are a number of things that don't help you. So for example, let's say
Mr. Avery, I understand that, and you can go into that at length, but I have a lot of questions, and if you want to move on, I will wait for other people to ask questions. But yeah, I got your answer to that specific question. Thank you.
All right.
My next question would be, unless somebody comes up with something, is you have those safety swimmers, and you showed the video of one of them being a Coast Guard rescue swimmer whose training is at the nth level, of anybody swimming in those kind of environments. And you said you had rescue swimmers swimming along them. Is it just a function of time? I mean, even the swimmers that were swimming with that Coast Guard reference swimmer with a dry suit, with insulation, was their time also limited?
Your time is, yes, your time is always limited, because the only thing, there are a couple of things that thermal protection does. One is it prevents cold shock. Two is it delays incapacitation and hypothermia. So what the dry suit or the wetsuit is doing is it's preventing cold shock on the front end, and it's buying you time. And the amount of time it buys depends on the insulation. So even if you have someone in, let's say, a survival suit that abandons a sinking fishing vessel in the Bering Sea, and that's a level of insulation that there's no way you could paddle in it, eventually that person is going to become hypothermic, and they're not going to make it.
Mr. Avery, I appreciate your honesty on that, because even if you have all the gear, it's a function of time, correct?
Yes, it absolutely is a function of time.
Thank you, sir. That is honesty, a level that we've rarely seen. Thank you. I have other questions, but if other people want to.
Well, how about there's some background noise that's some distracting. I don't know if that's from Moulton or Ken, but whatever that background noise is, if someone could mute that, that would be great. Sorry for accidentally muting you, Ken. But let's check in with some others. I know Ken has more questions. Does anyone else have a question or a comment?
Well, yeah. I am wondering if you, to some extent, can actually prepare yourself for the cold shock. And I remember up till probably like close to 10 years ago, I used to take cold showers and enjoy them. And I could just have a conversation while in the shower and taking it. And when I fairly recently, meaning that the problem with the breathing, I didn't experience as to the extent that you displayed in the video there, and cold water out of the shower is not as cold as you had it in those in that video. Is there a way? Is there a certain to a certain extent can you kind of train yourself for the shock?
Absolutely. And the term for that, the scientific term for that is acclimation. So it used to be called acclimatization, but they've kind of moved to acclimation as it. And you can actually acclimate to cold with relatively limited number of short duration exposures. Most paddlers don't do that. They're not willing to do it or whatever, but it lasts for a fairly long time. So if you acclimated at the beginning of the season, you would probably have that protection for the duration of the off-season paddling time. We discussed that on our website, and what that does, Horst, is that it reduces or eliminates the cold shock, but it does not do anything for incapacitation. So what you're doing is eliminating or reducing the cold shock on the front end. The only thing that physiologically that we know that really makes a difference in terms of how of slowing down incapacitation or hypothermia is body fat. So if you have a very fat person, they will last a lot longer than someone who doesn't have a lot of body fat. But the body fat doesn't protect them against cold shock, because cold shock is triggered by nerves that are on the skin surface above that layer of fat. So that's why, you know, the cold shock fat doesn't help you with cold shock, but boy, it's tremendous with incapacitation. And there's a film that was made called The Deep about an Icelandic fisherman who was the only survivor of his fishing crew their boat caught their nets off Heme Island on the Vestment Archipelago one night, and it just turned this fishing vessel right upside down. They had very little time, and they had no thermal protection. This guy swam for like 6 hours to reach shore. He was the only survivor. It really caught the attention of the cold water research community. And they hopped on some planes to Iceland and checked this guy out top to bottom. And it was the fact that he was built more like a seal than he was, because of all that. And that's how these aquatic mammals like seals, walruses, whales, that's how they do it. They have this insulating layer of fat. We call it blubber, but basically it's a layer of fat. So we discuss that on the website, and it's just one of those very interesting things about cold water and how we respond to it. But your experience with the cold water showers is exactly on point. And that's a very good way of doing it. I used to do this stuff when I was younger, but that cold shock causes an immediate spike in your heart rate and blood pressure. And I'm a little more cautious about doing it. Not to mention, I guess, my shrieking might wake the neighbors. But it is a good way. It is a good way if you're willing to do it. But it's very uncomfortable when you first start.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're
And
welcome.
it looks like Mark has his hand up.
Okay.
Is that correct, Mark?
Yes. My question is probably common to most of us. Often, we will start out with all the gear on, but by the time we're halfway down, the sun's come out, we've been exerting ourselves paddling, we're sweating like pigs, and there's a very strong desire to shed some layers and be comfortable. And yet, of course, that's increasing our vulnerability. And, it seems like, it's you got to, choose one to, compensate for comfort and at the same time, protect yourself safely. So obviously you can stop and take off some layers for lunch or something, or dunk yourself. But, if that's pretty short term, and it's easy to get cold when you start sweating. So I just wondered what advice you have along those lines.
Well, I think it's an excellent question, first of all, and I think it's a balancing act. What I would say is that you're looking at the environment. Let's say you're going down a whitewater river, and you know that because of the width of the river and so forth, that unless you get pinned or something weird happens, you're going to be able to get to shore, let's say, within a minute or 2 or 3. That's one thing. If you're out open water, you're kayaking in Puget Sound and you're half a mile or a mile from shore, and you go over and your boat blows away, that's a different story. So I think it is a judgment call. Experience is your friend when you're doing this. What I do to avoid this overheating is I'll pull the Neo hood back and I'll splash cold water on my head if I need to. Keep it, pull it back, but keep it over my ears and just get my head wet, just my hair wet, and then, keep paddling. After a while, I'm not overheating anymore. Pull the Neo hood back over again. Another thing I'll do is I roll to keep cool, what we call rotary cooling. So, there's that. I think you can tell pretty quickly when you start out whether you're going to be a little too warm. You start out, you're paddling down the river, you're starting to overheat. you know, you've got a call there. You can either keep splashing water on yourself, you keep rolling, getting your hair wet. If that doesn't do it, you need to pull over and take off a layer, just the top layer. You don't have to take the whole dry suit off. And I think if you do that and you keep a record, either mentally or on paper, after the trip of what the conditions were like, the air, you know, wind, what the water temperature's like, you get to a point, I think, if you're paddling regularly, by the end of the season, you have a pretty good idea of what you need to wear at in those conditions. You know, and this is, I think, what separates the cold water paddler who's just getting into it versus the pro. Because the pro knows exactly what he needs to wear under those conditions. And if he starts to get a little too hot, he takes steps to cool down. I've got an article on this called Keeping Your Cool in the Heat that I can send to Marie. And I've also got a little short video that I made in the backyard. It's rough, but it was during that recent heat wave that we had this past summer. It's like 115 degrees in the backyard. And I'm out there in my 7 mil long sleeve shorty demonstrating how effectively the evaporation off of that wetsuit will cool you. You mentioned stopping for lunch. What happens when you stop for lunch is your heat production all of a sudden takes a nosedive. So you're not making as much heat anymore. Let's say you're wearing a wetsuit and it's wet. A little breeze comes along. Water starts evaporating from that wetsuit. All of a sudden you're feeling chilled. What I take along in my paddles for situations like that is I'll bring a couple of contractor garbage bags, and if somebody's in that situation, I'll slip one of those on them. You cut a little hole for the head to come out if you want to, or just make it eye holes so they can pretend they're, you know, trick-or-treating for Halloween or whatever. But the point is it works. Or you can put on a rain jacket, something like that. Anything to cut the evaporation and to block the wind. You know, if somebody's cold, I'll put something like that on and I'll have them start walking, you know, to increase that heat production. And I'll do that myself if I'm at a put in and you know it's taking too long and everybody's just standing around. I'll just start walking, just increase my heat production a little bit. So my point here is that there isn't a magic answer, but there are techniques. And there are ways to stimulate your heat production. There are ways to cut your heat loss. And once you understand those, that's what provides you with the flexibility to work with your gear. And I'd say it's an active process. You don't have as much flexibility as you do on the trail because you just can't stop, slip your day pack off, whip off a layer, stick it in the pack, and then keep on going. You're not that flexible out on the water, but you can finesse it.
All right, we're getting close to the 9 o'clock hour. So one final question from Bob.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Angie wanted to add something.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, just real quick. I just wanted to add that another, talking about acclimatizing in the shower. When we're at the put-in and we're getting ready to go out, and we always wade into the water, like you said, we're always swim testing. Another reason to do that, I always think, is it mentally prepares you in a different way. Because it's one thing when you get in the boat and you stick your hands in the water to feel how cold it is, but when you wade in, you're mentally prepared in a different way. Mm-hmm. So that's all I wanted to say. Was then you go, oh, I know what it's going to feel like if I roll. I know what it's going to feel like if I come out of my boat. Mm-hmm. So it puts you in a different headspace. But that's all I was going to add.
I know a lot of whitewater paddlers are fond of, splashing some water on their face, cold water on their face, when they put in. I think there's value in that. And that's because water hitting your face can cause various things, and it can change your cardiac rate and stuff. And I think just a little splashing of the water on your face, that kind of prepares you for it. It just it's weird how the mind works, but you've got, this feedback system, and it's not a complete surprise when you go in if you've done that a little bit on the front end. So.
Robert?
Can you hear me?
Go for it.
Yes.
Go for it.
Oh, well, I'm a little older paddler even than you, a lot of years, but I have a curious question.
Okay.
The last 3 years, I've had a pacemaker. Now, a pacemaker just kind of keeps a steady pace. So I was thinking, if I suddenly hit the cold water, my heart wouldn't respond like that, so I'd be safer, right?
Your heart, well, as my wife says, good question for your doctor. But what I will say is there are two things that are happening there. One of them is an increase in heart rate.
Yeah.
That wouldn't affect you. But the way that your skin blood vessels respond to cold is that they constrict. It's a vasoconstriction. And that, if you don't have on thermal protection, that's the entire surface of your body vasoconstricting. And that will put a pressure spike in your BP that's unreal. So, I'm glad you're breaking trail for me. I think it's a
something to think about.
It's
thank you very much.
But I'm glad you're still paddling, and I think that the blood pressure thing is the variable that would affect you.
Well, thank you, Moulton. It's been a great presentation and conversation. I know people have questions, but I know you're very active in social media, so maybe people can follow up then.
Well, I think Mark had a whole bunch of additional questions, and he's welcome to either ask them on our Facebook page or just PM me on Facebook and ask any of them. I welcome anybody to send questions to me. I may not get back in touch the same day, just depends on what we're doing. But I always try to answer them, and I appreciate it when people write